For 70 years, the architecture of global security rested on a deceptively simple premise. Nations that trade together rarely go to war with each other, and nations that defend each other rarely let commerce come between them. That premise is now being tested in ways that few policymakers anticipated, and even fewer are prepared to manage. Across every major alliance system built in the aftermath of the Second World War, trade disputes are quietly corroding the foundations of military cooperation, diplomatic trust, and intelligence sharing that once seemed unshakable. The weapons in these conflicts are not missiles or aircraft carriers. They are tariffs, export controls, investment restrictions, and supply chain realignments. The casualties are not measured in lives, but in decades of institutional credibility and the informal trust networks that make collective security function. This is the story of how economic warfare is remaking the map of global alliances in ways that will define the coming century. The transformation began gradually, but has accelerated with startling speed in the past decade. Traditional military alliances were forged in an era when economic interdependence was assumed to be a stabilizing force. NATO members traded freely among themselves precisely because they shared a common adversary and a common commitment to mutual defense. The same logic applied to the network of bilateral treaties binding the United States to Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines. Economic integration was not separate from security cooperation. It was understood to reinforce it. But that assumption has collapsed under the weight of a new reality. Economic leverage has become the primary tool of pressure between both adversaries and allies, and nations are discovering that their trading partners can inflict damage that their military adversaries cannot. The clearest illustration of this dynamic emerged when the United States imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the European Union in 2018, invoking national security provisions under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. The legal justification was that dependence on foreign steel threatened the American defense industrial base. The practical effect was to treat NATO allies as economic threats equivalent to strategic competitors. European leaders reacted with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Germany, France, and the United Kingdom had spent decades integrating their defense industries with American systems, purchasing American aircraft, participating in joint development programs, and contributing forces to American-led operations from Afghanistan to the Balkans. The message embedded in the tariffs was unmistakable. When commercial interests collide with alliance commitments, commerce wins. Retaliatory tariffs followed, targeting American agricultural products and consumer goods in a tit-for-tat escalation that achieved nothing strategically but damaged the reservoir of goodwill that makes alliance coordination possible in moments of genuine crisis. The long-term effects of that episode are still unfolding. European defense planners began accelerating efforts toward strategic autonomy, developing independent satellite navigation systems, funding continental defense initiatives, and openly questioning whether American security guarantees could be trusted when American trade policy treated allies as adversaries. The Permanent Structured Cooperation Framework and the European Defense Fund received new urgency. French calls for a European army, once dismissed as Gaullist nostalgia, gained traction in capitals that had previously resisted any dilution of the NATO framework. None of this constitutes an immediate rupture, but it represents a slow hemorrhage of the institutional confidence that holds collective defense together. Allies who are uncertain whether they can rely on each other economically become allies who hedge their security bets, and hedging is the first step toward fragmentation. A parallel dynamic has played out in East Asia with consequences that are arguably more dangerous given the concentration of military flashpoints in the region. In 2019, Japan imposed export controls on critical semiconductor materials destined for South Korea, citing national security concerns but widely understood as retaliation for South Korean court rulings on wartime labor compensation. South Korea responded by threatening to withdraw from the General Security of Military Information Agreement, the intelligence sharing pact that allows the two nations to exchange classified data on North Korean missile launches and Chinese military movements. For several months, the possibility loomed that two of America's most important Indo-Pacific allies would stop talking to each other about the threats they face jointly, not because of any strategic disagreement, but because of a trade dispute rooted in historical grievances and domestic political pressures. The agreement was eventually preserved, but the episode revealed how thin the membrane separating economic friction from security dysfunction has become. Both nations maintain tens of thousands of troops oriented toward shared threats, yet neither could prevent a tariff conflict from threatening the intelligence architecture that makes coordinated defense possible. China has observed these fractures with keen interest and has refined economic coercion into a strategic instrument of remarkable precision. When Australia called for an independent investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, China responded with a cascade of trade restrictions targeting Australian wine, barley, coal, beef, and lobster. The message was not subtle. Nations that challenge Beijing on politically sensitive issues will pay an economic price designed to inflict maximum pain on politically influential domestic constituencies. Similar patterns have emerged with Lithuania after it allowed Taiwan to open a representative office under the name Taiwan rather than Chinese Taipei, with South Korea after it deployed the Thyad missile defense system, and with Norway after the Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident. In each case, the economic punishment was calibrated to signal that alignment with Western security priorities carries costs that Beijing can impose at will. The cumulative effect of this coercion is a quiet erosion of trust across the Indo-Pacific security network. Nations considering closer cooperation with the United States or participation in initiatives like the Quad must weigh the economic consequences of antagonizing their largest trading partner. For many, the calculus is uncomfortable. Security guarantees from Washington are valuable but abstract. Export revenues from China are immediate and measurable. The result is a persistent hedging behavior in which nations publicly affirm their commitment to a rules-based order, while privately limiting the depth of their strategic alignment to avoid triggering economic retaliation. This is precisely the outcome Beijing intends, not to peel allies away from the United States in dramatic fashion, but to constrain their behavior through the constant implicit threat of commercial punishment. The concept of friendshoring emerged as one proposed solution to this vulnerability. The idea is elegant in theory. Democracies should restructure their supply chains to source critical components from allied nations rather than potential adversaries, reducing exposure to economic coercion while strengthening the industrial base of the alliance network. In practice, the implementation has revealed deep contradictions. Allied nations compete with each other for the same industries. American subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing under the CHIPS Act directly threaten the market position of allied producers in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. European green energy subsidies conflict with American incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act. Each nation pursuing supply chain resilience is simultaneously pursuing industrial advantage, and the two objectives frequently collide. The promise of friendshoring as a unifying alliance strategy has instead become another arena for economic friction, with allies accusing each other of protectionism dressed in the language of security. Domestic political pressures compound these tensions in ways that alliance managers struggle to contain. Industries facing foreign competition have discovered that invoking national security provides a rhetorical shield against accusations of protectionism. Steel producers, semiconductor manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and agricultural lobbies have all learned to frame their commercial interests in the language of strategic necessity. Politicians seeking electoral advantage find it easier to blame foreign trading partners than to address structural economic problems at home. The result is a ratchet effect in which trade barriers justified by security concerns become politically impossible to remove, even when the underlying disputes are resolved. Each tariff creates a constituency for its perpetuation, and the cumulative weight of these constituencies gradually pulls alliance partners apart. Against this backdrop, the emergence of economically driven alliances represents a significant structural innovation. AUKUS, the trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, is explicitly designed around industrial cooperation, the transfer of nuclear submarine technology, the joint development of hypersonic weapons, and the integration of advanced manufacturing capabilities. Unlike traditional alliances defined primarily by mutual defense obligations, AUKUS is built on mutual industrial investment. The partners are bound together not just by shared threat perceptions, but by shared production lines, shared intellectual property, and shared sunk costs that make defection economically irrational. This model may prove more durable than treaty commitments alone precisely because it creates material interdependencies that persist regardless of political shifts in any single capital. The Group of Seven has undergone a parallel evolution, increasingly functioning as an economic security coordination mechanism rather than simply a forum for macroeconomic policy discussion. Recent summits have focused on countering economic coercion, coordinating export controls on advanced technologies, and developing shared frameworks for screening foreign investment in critical infrastructure. The G7 is becoming, in effect, a committee for managing the economic dimensions of great power competition. Whether this represents a strengthening of the Western alliance system or an acknowledgement that traditional security institutions are insufficient to address contemporary threats remains an open question. What is clear is that economic coordination has moved from the periphery to the center of alliance strategy in ways that would have seemed inconceivable a generation ago. Developing nations observe these shifts with a mixture of opportunity and apprehension. For decades, the primary alignment question for countries in the Global South was ideological: democracy or authoritarianism, capitalism or socialism, East or West. Today, the primary alignment question is economic. Which partnerships offer the best terms for infrastructure investment, market access, and technology transfer? China's Belt and Road Initiative has reshaped the calculus for nations across Africa, Central Asia, and Latin America, offering development financing with fewer conditions than Western alternatives. The United States and its allies have struggled to compete, constrained by domestic political resistance to foreign aid, private sector reluctance to invest in high-risk environments, and the perception that Western engagement comes with governance demands that recipient governments prefer to avoid. The result is a growing number of nations that maintain formal security relationships with Western powers while deepening economic ties with China, a hedging strategy that fragments the coherence of the alliance networks built in the previous century. The long-term consequences for global governance are profound. International institutions designed around the assumption of converging interests among major powers are increasingly paralyzed by fundamental disagreements over the rules of economic engagement. The World Trade Organization cannot resolve disputes between its largest members because those members no longer agree on what the trading system should accomplish. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank face competition from alternative financing mechanisms that operate outside their governance frameworks. The United Nations Security Council remains gridlocked on questions where economic interests align with geopolitical competition. These institutions are not collapsing, but they are losing relevance as the primary arenas for managing global economic order. In their place, a patchwork of regional arrangements, bilateral deals, and ad hoc coalitions is emerging, each reflecting the particular interests of its participants rather than any universal principles of international cooperation. Preparing for this multipolar future requires acknowledging that economic power has become the primary currency of international influence. Military strength remains essential for deterrence and crisis response, but the daily business of alliance management now revolves around investment flows, supply chain configurations, and market access negotiations. Nations that master the integration of economic and security strategy will thrive. Nations that treat them as separate domains will find themselves perpetually surprised by the linkages between commercial disputes and defense cooperation. The strategic options available range from deep integration with like-minded partners, accepting the constraints that such integration imposes, to hedged autonomy, preserving flexibility at the cost of reduced access to alliance benefits. No option is costless, and the choices made in the coming decade will lock in patterns of alignment that persist for generations. The trajectory of alliance stability over the next 10 years will depend on whether major powers can develop shared norms for economic engagement that prevent commercial disputes from metastasizing into security crises. The evidence to date is not encouraging. Tariff conflicts continue to flare between allies. Economic coercion remains a preferred tool for revisionist powers seeking to fracture opposing coalitions. Domestic political incentives in democratic nations favor protectionism over coordination, yet the underlying logic of collective security retains its force. No nation can meet the challenges of great power competition, climate disruption, pandemic disease, and technological transformation alone. The question is whether that logic will prove sufficient to overcome the centrifugal pressures that trade wars unleash. The answer will determine whether the alliance systems that preserved peace for 7 decades adapt to a new era or fracture under the weight of economic conflicts they were never designed to withstand. That determination is being made now, in negotiating rooms and legislative chambers and corporate boardrooms, by actors who may not recognize the stakes of the decisions they are making.